Why ancient Egyptian pharaohs married their sisters. A sleepy historical journey through power, gods, and one very complicated family tree. Hey guys, tonight we're starting with a question that sounds like the setup to a very uncomfortable family reunion. Why did ancient Egyptian pharaohs marry their sisters? Now, if you're listening to this while falling asleep, you may have just opened one eye and thought, wait, what? And honestly, that's a reasonable reaction. Because from a modern perspective, the idea sounds shocking, strange, and more than a little confusing. Yet for thousands of years, some of the most powerful rulers on earth did exactly that. Brothers married sisters. Half-siblings married one another. Royal families repeatedly arranged marriages within their own household. And somehow, this became one of the most recognizable features of ancient Egyptian royalty. Tonight, we're going to slowly explore why. We'll wander through the temples and palaces of the Nile. We'll meet kings who believed they were gods. Queens who wielded enormous power. Families who considered themselves different from ordinary people. And we'll discover that the answer has surprisingly little to do with romance and almost everything to do with power. Because if there's one thing history teaches us, it's that whenever rulers do something bizarre, power is usually hiding somewhere nearby. So dim the lights, settle into your favorite chair, and let's drift back more than 4,000 years to the banks of the Nile. The world of the pharaohs. To understand why Egyptian pharaohs married their sisters, we first need to understand how Egyptians viewed their rulers. Because pharaohs were not simply kings. At least not in the way we usually imagine kings. Most ancient kingdoms had rulers who claimed authority from the gods. Egyptian pharaohs went one step further. They were often considered divine themselves. The pharaoh stood at the center of the universe. He maintained order. He communicated with the gods. He ensured that the Nile flooded properly. He protected Egypt from chaos. No pressure, of course. Just responsibility for the functioning of existence itself. The ancient Egyptians believed in a concept called Ma'at. Ma'at represented cosmic order, balance, and harmony. Everything depended on maintaining it. Without Ma'at, society would collapse. The natural world would unravel. Chaos would triumph. And nobody wanted that. Especially tax collectors. The pharaoh's primary job was protecting Ma'at. This elevated him far above ordinary people. In Egyptian thinking, royal families occupied a unique place between humanity and divinity, which meant ordinary rules did not always apply. And that distinction would eventually influence marriage. The gods set the example. One of the biggest reasons for royal sibling marriage can be found in Egyptian mythology. Ancient Egyptians looked to the gods as models. And the gods, frankly, had extraordinarily complicated family relationships. Take Osiris and Isis. Osiris was one of Egypt's most important gods. Isis was one of Egypt's most beloved goddesses. They were husband and wife. They were also brother and sister. Already things are getting complicated. Then there was Set and Nephthys. Also siblings. Also married. The divine family tree often resembled a knot that nobody wanted to untangle. For Egyptians, however, this wasn't strange. It was sacred. The gods represented perfection. If divine siblings could marry, then royal siblings could potentially do the same. After all, pharaohs were considered earthly reflections of divine power. By marrying sisters, kings symbolically imitated the gods themselves. It reinforced their sacred status. The message was simple. We are not ordinary people. We belong to the same divine tradition as the gods. From a political perspective, this was extremely useful. From the perspective of future genealogists, less so. Keeping power inside the family. Religion explains part of the story. Politics explains the rest. And politics is usually where history becomes interesting. Imagine you're a pharaoh. You control enormous wealth. You command armies. You oversee temples. You own vast lands. You possess authority beyond anything most people could imagine. Now imagine marrying a foreign princess. Suddenly another family gains influence. Another kingdom gains connections. New political complications appear. Power begins spreading outward. Ancient rulers generally disliked sharing power. A timeless tradition. By marrying within the royal family, pharaohs could keep wealth, influence, and legitimacy concentrated. The throne remained tied to a specific bloodline. Potential rivals gained fewer opportunities. The royal house stayed unified. At least in theory. In practice, royal families still argued constantly. Because no amount of divine symbolism can prevent relatives from disagreeing. The great royal wife. One detail often surprises modern audiences. Many Egyptian queens possessed remarkable authority. The title Great Royal Wife carried enormous prestige. Some queens participated directly in government. Others influenced diplomacy, religion, and succession. A royal sister could be uniquely valuable because her status already matched the king's. She shared the same sacred lineage. She belonged to the same dynastic tradition. Her children possessed unquestionable royal credentials. This mattered tremendously. Succession crises terrified ancient rulers. Every kingdom feared disputes over inheritance. Sibling marriages helped simplify claims to legitimacy. Or at least that was the goal. History repeatedly demonstrated that humans can argue about absolutely anything, including supposedly simple succession plans. Were all pharaohs marrying their sisters? Here's where things become more complicated. Not every pharaoh married a sister. This is one of the biggest misconceptions about ancient Egypt. Some did. Many did not. Royal sibling marriage appeared more frequently during certain periods than others. Different dynasties followed different traditions. Some kings married foreign princesses. Others married noblewomen. Others had multiple wives. Egyptian history lasted more than 3,000 years. That's a very long time. Long enough for customs to change repeatedly. When people imagine ancient Egypt, they often compress thousands of years into a single picture. But Egyptian civilization experienced enormous variation. Practices that were common during one dynasty might be unusual centuries later. The story is much more complicated than a single rule applied everywhere. And history loves complexity. Even when documentary filmmakers wish it would occasionally cooperate. No discussion of royal sibling marriage would be complete without mentioning the famous boy king, Tutankhamun. Possibly the most recognizable pharaoh in the world. Mainly because his tomb remained remarkably intact. Archaeologists love finding things untouched. It's considerably easier than finding things that have already been stolen. Evidence suggests Tutankhamun married his half-sister. This followed established royal traditions. Modern genetic research has revealed that several members of his family were closely related. The findings have sparked enormous discussion among historians and scientists. They also illustrate some of the long-term risks associated with repeated marriages between close relatives. Ancient Egyptians, of course, did not possess modern genetics. They evaluated marriage according to religious and political priorities. Different knowledge led to different decisions. And those decisions left fascinating clues for researchers thousands of years later. By the time we reach Cleopatra, the story becomes even more intriguing. Cleopatra belonged to the Ptolemaic dynasty. This ruling family originated from Macedonia after the conquests of Alexander the Great. The Ptolemies enthusiastically embraced sibling marriage, sometimes to an astonishing degree. Brother-sister marriages became a regular feature of royal politics. The goal remained familiar: preserve power, protect legitimacy, maintain dynastic identity. The result was a family tree that occasionally looked more like a circle. Cleopatra herself was married to her brothers according to dynastic custom. Although political realities eventually made those arrangements far more complicated than ceremonial tradition intended. As often happened in royal families, ambition had a habit of disrupting carefully planned marriages. So why did ancient Egyptian pharaohs marry their sisters? The answer lies in three powerful forces: religion, politics, and legitimacy. The gods provided the example. Royal ideology encouraged imitation. Political calculations rewarded keeping power within the family. And dynastic concerns reinforced the practice across generations. To modern eyes, the custom feels strange. To ancient Egyptian rulers, it often seemed logical. History is filled with practices that make perfect sense within their original world and appear bewildering centuries later. And that's part of what makes studying the past so fascinating. Because every civilization viewed reality through its own assumptions. The pharaohs looked at sibling marriage and saw divine authority. Modern audiences look at it and immediately have questions. Many questions. Which is probably the healthiest response. As we leave the banks of the Nile tonight, remember that ancient rulers were often trying to solve problems of power, succession, and legitimacy. They simply did so in ways that feel very unfamiliar today. And occasionally those solutions produced some of the most unusual family trees in human history. Sleep well. Why ancient Egyptian pharaohs married their sisters. The dark side of divine blood. Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're continuing our slow journey into one of the strangest customs in royal history. Last time, we explored why Egyptian pharaohs sometimes married their sisters. We discovered that religion, politics, and royal legitimacy all played major roles. But tonight we're going deeper. Because whenever people hear about royal sibling marriage, one question inevitably appears. Did it actually work? Or did it create problems? As it turns out, the answer is complicated. History's favorite answer. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's continue our journey through the palaces and temples of ancient Egypt. Becoming living gods. One of the most important things to understand about Egyptian royalty is that they were constantly trying to appear different from everyone else. Not slightly different. Completely different. A farmer along the Nile and the pharaoh might both be human beings, but Egyptian royal ideology insisted that they occupied entirely separate worlds. The king was often described as the son of the gods. Temple carvings portrayed him receiving authority directly from divine beings. Priests performed rituals emphasizing his sacred status. Every public ceremony reinforced the same message. The pharaoh was not ordinary. This distinction mattered enormously, because power often depends on perception. If people believe a ruler possesses divine authority, governing becomes considerably easier. At least until taxes are involved. Taxes have a remarkable ability to weaken enthusiasm for almost any ruler. Sibling marriage became part of this larger effort. It created a royal family that appeared separate from society. A family that followed its own sacred rules. The stranger the custom appeared to outsiders, the more it emphasized royal uniqueness. And uniqueness was valuable, especially when your entire government depended on convincing millions of people that you were chosen by the gods. Royal women and hidden power. Modern discussions often focus on kings. Ancient Egypt, however, produced some extraordinarily powerful women, and many of them played far greater political roles than people realize. Queens were not always passive figures standing quietly beside powerful men. Some acted as advisors. Some controlled wealth. Some influenced religious institutions. Some effectively governed. Others became rulers in their own right. A royal sister could therefore represent a particularly useful political partner. She already belonged to the sacred dynasty. She already understood court politics. She already possessed legitimacy. From the perspective of a ruling king, this offered obvious advantages. Foreign princesses arrived with unfamiliar loyalties. Royal sisters arrived with established connections. Of course, this did not guarantee harmony. History contains many examples of siblings who disagreed rather passionately. Ancient royal families were no exception. Being related rarely prevents political conflict. Sometimes it encourages it. The problem nobody wanted to discuss. Now we arrive at a topic that ancient Egyptians themselves probably viewed very differently than modern audiences. Repeated marriages between close relatives can create biological risks. Today we understand genetics. Ancient Egyptians did not. They evaluated marriage through religion, politics, and tradition. Modern science has allowed researchers to examine some royal remains. The findings suggest that certain royal families may have experienced health problems linked to generations of close intermarriage. However, historians are careful about drawing conclusions. Ancient people faced countless health challenges. Disease, nutrition, accidents, infections, and environmental factors all influenced outcomes. Still, the evidence has encouraged debate. And it reminds us that political solutions sometimes carry unexpected consequences. Ancient rulers sought to preserve dynasties. They were not conducting long-term genetic studies, which, admittedly, would have been difficult with Bronze Age technology. Akhenaten, Egypt's most unusual pharaoh. Few Egyptian rulers generate more discussion than Akhenaten. And that's saying something. Because Egyptian history contains no shortage of fascinating personalities. Akhenaten radically transformed Egyptian religion. He promoted the worship of the Aten, represented by the sun disk. Traditional religious systems were challenged. Temples changed. Art styles evolved. The entire kingdom entered a period of dramatic experimentation. Even by royal standards, Akhenaten was unusual. His family relationships remain the subject of intense scholarly interest. Evidence suggests that close royal marriages continued during this period. The dynasty appears to have maintained strong beliefs about preserving sacred bloodlines. Yet Akhenaten's reign demonstrates an important point. Sibling marriage was never an isolated custom. It existed within a much larger system of religious beliefs, political strategies, and royal traditions. Remove those surrounding ideas and the practice makes little sense. Place it inside that world and it becomes easier to understand. Not necessarily relatable, but understandable. History often asks us to do exactly that. When brothers and sisters became rivals, royal marriages did not eliminate competition. In fact, they sometimes intensified it. Because royal families were full of ambitious individuals. Imagine growing up knowing that immense wealth, influence, and power surround your family. Now imagine multiple relatives competing for access to that power. Things can become tense rather quickly. Ancient Egypt experienced numerous succession disputes. Brothers challenged brothers. Half-siblings competed against one another. Relatives formed alliances. Political factions emerged. Marriage alone could not solve these problems. In some cases, it merely rearranged them. Human beings remain remarkably consistent across thousands of years. Give a group of people access to power and competition usually follows. Whether the setting is a modern office or an ancient palace. Only the clothing changes. What ordinary Egyptians thought. One of the great mysteries of ancient history involves public opinion. What did ordinary Egyptians actually think about royal sibling marriages? Unfortunately, ancient farmers did not leave behind opinion polls, which historians would absolutely love. Imagine discovering a 3,000-year-old survey. How satisfied are you with current royal marriage policies? The reality is less convenient. Most surviving records come from elites. Priests, officials, royal inscriptions. Yet available evidence suggests that royal customs were often viewed as separate from ordinary life. The king occupied a unique category. Different expectations applied. Different rules applied. Different religious meanings applied. Ordinary Egyptians generally did not organize their family lives around royal traditions. The pharaoh's household belonged to another world entirely. A sacred world. A political world. A world most people would never experience directly. Why the practice survived for centuries? Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of royal sibling marriage is not that it existed. It's that it lasted so long. Generations of rulers continued the tradition. Dynasties rose and fell. Foreign invaders arrived. Religious beliefs evolved. Yet the custom repeatedly reappeared. Why? Because it solved problems that rulers cared about. It reinforced legitimacy. It protected dynastic identity. It symbolized divine authority. As long as those goals remained important, the tradition retained value. Eventually circumstances changed. Egypt came under foreign influence. New political realities emerged. Different cultural expectations developed. The ancient world transformed. And gradually the custom faded into history. But for thousands of years, it remained one of the most distinctive features of Egyptian royalty. Closing thoughts. The story of Egyptian royal sibling marriage isn't really a story about romance. It's a story about power. About how rulers justified authority. about how societies explained legitimacy, about how religion and politics intertwined. Most importantly, it's a reminder that the past operated according to rules very different from our own. The pharaohs were trying to preserve dynasties, maintain sacred traditions, protect political stability. Whether those goals justified their methods is a question modern audiences can debate. Ancient rulers, however, rarely asked for our opinion, which was probably convenient for them, and perhaps slightly disappointing for historians, because there are definitely a few meetings from ancient history that we would all love to attend. Sleep well. And next time, we'll explore the daily lives of Egyptian pharaohs, what they ate, how they lived, what frightened them, and why being worshipped as a living god was not always as enjoyable as it sounds. Why ancient Egyptian pharaohs married their sisters. Part 3, The Lonely Life of a Living God. Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're continuing our journey through the strange and fascinating world of ancient Egyptian royalty. So far we've explored why pharaohs sometimes married their sisters. We've looked at religion, politics, dynasties, and the endless royal obsession with preserving power. But tonight we're stepping inside the palace itself. Because understanding these marriages requires understanding the people involved. What was life actually like for a pharaoh? Was it endless luxury? Did they spend their days relaxing beside the Nile while servants brought them grapes and fans? Or was something else happening behind the gold, jewels, and giant statues? As usual, the answer is more complicated. History enjoys being complicated. So get comfortable, relax, and let's walk through the palace gates of ancient Egypt. Growing up royal. Most pharaohs never experienced a normal childhood. Not that there was a standard ancient Egyptian childhood handbook. But royal children lived in a very different world. From birth, they were surrounded by servants, tutors, priests, and officials. Every action mattered. Every lesson mattered. Every relationship mattered. Because one day they might rule Egypt. And ruling Egypt was not a part-time job. Young princes learned reading and writing. They studied religion. They practiced military skills. They learned diplomacy. They learned court etiquette. And perhaps most importantly, they learned that they were different. Very different. Ordinary children might grow up helping their families farm along the Nile. A prince grew up being told he possessed divine blood. That's a rather unusual thing to hear before breakfast. Imagine being 10 years old and constantly reminded that the gods had special plans for you. The pressure must have been enormous. The palace was not always a happy place. When people imagine royal palaces, they often picture luxury. And to be fair, there was plenty of luxury. Beautiful furniture. Fine clothing. Jewelry. Gardens. Servants. Exotic animals. The finest food available. But luxury does not automatically create happiness. Ancient palaces were political battlefields. Every official wanted influence. Every noble wanted favor. Every priest wanted access. Every family member represented either an ally or a potential threat. Trust became difficult. The higher someone rose in power, the fewer people they could truly trust. This is one of the strange patterns that appears throughout history. The most powerful individuals often become the most isolated. And pharaohs were among the most powerful individuals on earth. The palace could feel crowded and lonely at the same time. which sounds impossible until you spend enough time studying royal history. Then it starts happening everywhere. Why family became so important. This helps explain why royal families placed such importance on bloodlines. The royal household became a protected inner circle. At least in theory. If outsiders were difficult to trust, family seemed safer. Or at least safer than ambitious nobles. Unfortunately, families are still families. Anyone who has attended a difficult holiday gathering already knows this. Ancient Egyptian royals argued, competed, formed alliances, held grudges, and occasionally made life extremely complicated for one another. Yet despite these conflicts, blood relationships remained politically valuable. A sister could be trusted with royal secrets. A sister understood royal expectations. A sister belonged to the same sacred lineage. The logic made sense within the royal worldview. Whether it actually reduced family drama is another matter entirely. History suggests the answer was often no. The weight of divine expectations. Imagine waking up every morning knowing millions of people believed your actions affected the universe. That was essentially the Pharaoh's situation. The king was expected to maintain order, maintain prosperity, maintain religious harmony, maintain stability, and somehow avoid upsetting the gods. A single military defeat could be interpreted as divine displeasure. A poor harvest could become a religious concern. Natural disasters raised uncomfortable questions. People looked to the Pharaoh for answers. Always. The burden must have been exhausting. Modern leaders face enormous pressure. Ancient pharaohs carried all of that plus responsibility for cosmic balance. It's enough to make a regular office job seem pleasantly uncomplicated. The fear of chaos. One of the deepest fears in ancient Egypt was chaos. Egyptians valued stability above almost everything else. The Nile flooded predictably. The seasons followed familiar patterns. Order brought prosperity. Chaos threatened survival. Royal marriages became part of this larger struggle. Every marriage was expected to strengthen stability. Every heir represented continuity. Every generation connected the present to the past. Sibling marriage fit neatly into this framework. It reduced uncertainty. Or at least it appeared to reduce uncertainty. Ancient rulers often preferred familiar risks to unknown risks. A principle that remains surprisingly common throughout history. And perhaps even today. Queens who became legends. While kings dominate many historical narratives, Egypt produced remarkable queens. Some became among the most famous women in history. One example is Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut did something extraordinary. She became pharaoh herself. Not merely queen. Not merely regent. Pharaoh. She adopted royal imagery. Commissioned monuments. Directed major building projects. Governed effectively for years. Her success demonstrates something important. Royal women were not simply decorative figures. They could wield genuine authority. And that authority helps explain why royal marriages mattered so much. A royal wife was often a political partner. Sometimes a political rival. Sometimes both simultaneously. Which tends to create interesting historical records. The strange world of royal ceremonies. Ancient Egyptian royalty lived in a world filled with rituals. Everything carried symbolic meaning. The king wore specific crowns for specific occasions. Ceremonies reinforced royal authority. Religious festivals connected rulers to the gods. Public appearances communicated power. Marriage itself carried symbolic significance. Royal unions represented more than personal relationships. They reflected cosmic order. Religious continuity. Political stability. When a pharaoh married his sister, Egyptians weren't simply witnessing a family event. They were witnessing a sacred act tied to broader ideas about kingship and divine authority. At least that's how royal ideology presented it. Reality, of course, was often messy. Reality usually the human side of history. One challenge historians face is remembering that famous rulers were still human beings. It's easy to view pharaohs as statues, monuments, names carved into stone. But they were people. They experienced fear, ambition, jealousy, pride, love, grief. They worried about succession. They worried about rivals. They worried about whether their achievements would be remembered. Just like many leaders throughout history. The difference is that their concerns became immortalized on temple walls. Most of us are fortunate enough not to have our awkward decisions preserved for 4,000 years. Ancient rulers were less lucky. Why we're still fascinated? Thousands of years have passed since the age of the pharaohs. Yet people remain fascinated. Why? Partly because ancient Egypt feels both familiar and mysterious. We recognize human emotions, family conflicts, political struggles, personal ambitions. At the same time, the culture feels distant and exotic. Giant pyramids rise from the desert. Gods appear with animal heads. Kings marry their sisters. Everything feels slightly unreal. And yet it all happened. Real people lived these lives, made these decisions, believed these ideas. The result is one of the most captivating civilizations in human history. Closing thoughts. Tonight we've stepped inside the world that produced one of history's most unusual royal traditions. We've seen how isolation, divine authority, political pressure, and fear of chaos shaped royal life. Most importantly, we've discovered that sibling marriage did not emerge from a single cause. It grew from an entire worldview. A worldview where kings were gods, families were dynasties, and political stability often outweighed personal preference. Next time, we'll explore some of the most famous royal families of ancient Egypt, including the dramatic stories of Tutankhamun, Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and Cleopatra. And as we'll discover, some of those family histories are every bit as complicated as you'd expect. Possibly more. Sleep well. Why ancient Egyptian pharaohs married their sisters. Part 4, Tutankhamun, Nefertiti, and the most famous family in ancient Egypt. Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're continuing our slow journey through the strange and fascinating world of ancient Egyptian royalty. Over the last few chapters we've explored why pharaohs married their sisters, how royal families viewed themselves, and what life was like inside the palaces along the Nile. But tonight we're meeting the celebrities of ancient Egypt. The names that continue to appear in documentaries, museums, books, and endless internet debates. Tutankhamun, Nefertiti, Akhenaten, and eventually Cleopatra. These are the figures who transformed Egyptian history into something that still captures our imagination thousands of years later. And as we'll discover, Their family stories are every bit as dramatic as the monuments they left behind. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's return to the golden age of the pharaohs. The boy king who refused to be forgotten. If ancient Egypt had a celebrity ranking system, Tutankhamun would almost certainly be near the top. Not because he conquered vast territories. Not because he built the largest temples. And not because he ruled for decades. In fact, he ruled for only a short time. The reason we remember him is surprisingly simple. His tomb survived. Or at least most of it did. For centuries, grave robbers emptied royal tombs across Egypt. Gold disappeared. Jewelry vanished. Treasures were scattered. Ancient thieves were remarkably efficient. Then, in 1922, archaeologists uncovered something extraordinary. The nearly intact tomb of Tutankhamun. Suddenly the world was staring directly into ancient royal life. Golden masks. Furniture. Weapons. Clothing. Chariots. Jewelry. Objects designed for eternity. Newspapers exploded with excitement. Museums filled with visitors. The young pharaoh became internationally famous. Thousands of years after his death. Which is a rather impressive comeback. A family full of mysteries. The deeper historians investigated Tutankhamun's family, the stranger the story became. His father is generally believed to have been Akhenaten, one of Egypt's most controversial rulers. His mother appears to have been a close relative of Akhenaten, possibly a sister. Modern genetic studies suggest that several members of the royal family were closely related. This has made Tutankhamun central to discussions about royal sibling marriage. Yet despite all the research, mysteries remain. Ancient Egypt rarely provides simple answers. Records are incomplete. Names disappear. Evidence is damaged. Every discovery seems to create 3 new questions. Historians spend much of their lives solving puzzles. Ancient Egypt specializes in manufacturing additional puzzles. Akhenaten, the pharaoh who tried to change everything. Before Tutankhamun became king, Egypt belonged to Akhenaten. And Akhenaten was not interested in doing things the traditional way. For centuries Egyptians worshipped a vast collection of gods. Temples flourished. Priests held influence. Religious traditions shaped everyday life. Then Akhenaten arrived, and essentially announced that the system needed major revisions. He promoted the worship of Aten, the solar disk. Old religious institutions lost power. New temples appeared. Ancient traditions were challenged. Many historians consider this one of the most dramatic religious transformations in Egyptian history. Not everyone was thrilled. Imagine changing a society's entire religious framework and expecting universal approval. The reaction was mixed. To put it politely, Akhenaten moved the royal court to a new capital city. He commissioned unusual artwork. He emphasized new religious ideas. Everything about his reign felt different, which is one reason historians remain fascinated by him. Nefertiti, the woman who still captivates the world. Alongside Akhenaten stood one of the most famous women of the ancient world. Nefertiti. Even people who know very little about Egyptian history often recognize her name. Or her famous bust. The sculpture discovered in 1912 became one of the most recognizable works of art ever created. More than 3,000 years after her lifetime, Nefertiti remains instantly recognizable. That's remarkable. Most of us would be thrilled if people remembered our names next Tuesday. Nefertiti appears prominently in royal art. She participated in ceremonies. She appears beside the king in unusually prominent ways. Some scholars even believe she may have exercised significant political authority, possibly more than many queens before her. Yet her ultimate fate remains mysterious. Records become unclear. References diminish. The trail grows cold. Ancient Egypt once again refuses to provide easy answers. The family that vanished. One of history's strangest disappearances involves the Amarna royal family. After Akhenaten's death, Egypt gradually returned to traditional religious practices. The new leadership reversed many reforms. Monuments were altered. Names were removed. Buildings were repurposed. Later rulers seemed eager to distance themselves from Akhenaten's legacy. It's almost as if future generations looked at the entire experiment and collectively decided, let's not do that again. As a result, reconstructing this period is extraordinarily difficult. Many records vanished. Others were intentionally destroyed. The surviving evidence resembles a giant historical jigsaw puzzle missing half its pieces. Historians continue debating details to this day, which, admittedly, keeps conferences interesting. Marriage and power in the royal household. Throughout these generations, marriage remained deeply political. Every royal union influenced succession. Every child represented a potential heir. Every relationship carried enormous implications. This helps explain why sibling marriage persisted among certain royal families. The goal wasn't personal happiness. The goal was continuity, stability, legitimacy, power. The modern concept of marrying primarily for love would have seemed secondary to many ancient rulers. A useful bonus perhaps, but not the main objective. History repeatedly demonstrates that royal marriages often resembled political contracts more than romantic partnerships. Ancient Egypt was no exception. What happened to Tutankhamun? The death of Tutankhamun remains one of history's enduring mysteries. For years, theories flourished. Assassination, accidents, disease, conspiracies, secret plots. History enthusiasts proposed everything. Because whenever a young king dies unexpectedly, speculation follows. Modern research suggests a combination of health problems and illness may have contributed. Yet absolute certainty remains elusive. Ancient history rarely offers complete confidence. The evidence whispers. It rarely shouts. What we do know is that Tutankhamun died young. His reign ended abruptly, and his tomb accidentally preserved a remarkable snapshot of royal life. A snapshot that continues teaching us about ancient Egypt more than 3,000 years later. The ancient world's most famous family drama. When people discuss sibling marriage among pharaohs, they often focus on shock value. But the real story is more interesting. It's about how ancient rulers viewed power, how they viewed divinity, how they viewed legitimacy. The royal family wasn't merely a family. It was an institution. A sacred institution. A political institution. A symbol of cosmic order. Marriage became one tool for preserving that institution. Whether it succeeded depended largely on circumstances. Sometimes it strengthened dynasties. Sometimes it created complications. Sometimes it did both simultaneously. History has a talent for multitasking. Closing thoughts. Tonight we've met some of ancient Egypt's most famous figures. Tutankhamun, the boy king who became immortal through archaeology. Akhenaten, the revolutionary ruler who challenged tradition. Nefertiti, the queen whose image still captivates millions. And behind them all, the complex network of royal relationships that shaped Egyptian history. The more closely we examine these families, the clearer one fact becomes. The pharaohs did not view marriage the way we do. For them, marriage was religion, politics, dynasty, power, and sometimes all four at once. Next time, we'll leave the royal palaces and explore something equally fascinating. What everyday Egyptians thought about their god-kings, how ordinary people lived along the Nile, and why some pharaohs were loved while others were quietly forgotten. Until then, sleep well. And be grateful that your family gatherings probably involve fewer succession crises than those of ancient Egypt. Why ancient Egyptian pharaohs married their sisters. Part 5. What ordinary Egyptians really thought about their god-kings. Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're stepping away from the golden palaces and royal tombs. For the last few chapters we've spent our time among kings, queens, priests, and dynasties. We've followed Tutankhamun into his tomb. We've watched Akhenaten challenge centuries of tradition. We've explored why royal families sometimes married brothers to sisters in their endless effort to preserve divine bloodlines. But tonight we're asking a different question. What did ordinary Egyptians think about all of this? Because while pharaohs built giant monuments and married within the royal family, millions of ordinary people were living very different lives. They farmed. They fished. They paid taxes. They raised children. And every year they watched the Nile flood and retreat. In many ways, these ordinary Egyptians were the true foundation of Egyptian civilization. Without them, the pyramids never rise. The temples never stand. The pharaohs never rule. So tonight, let's leave the throne room behind and walk into the villages that lined the Nile thousands of years ago. The Nile was everything. If ancient Egypt had a heartbeat, it was the Nile. Everything depended on it. The river provided water, food, transportation, trade, agriculture, life itself. Every year Egyptians waited for the annual flood. When the waters arrived, they spread rich black soil across the land. After the flood receded, farmers planted crops. Without this cycle, Egypt could not exist. It's difficult to exaggerate how important the river was. Imagine if your local grocery store, power company, water supply, highway system, and economy were all combined into one giant river. That would be roughly comparable. Naturally, many Egyptians believed the pharaoh played a role in maintaining this divine order. If the Nile flooded properly, people felt reassured. If something went wrong, uncomfortable questions sometimes followed. And rulers throughout history have generally preferred comfortable questions. Did ordinary Egyptians worship pharaohs? The answer is both yes and no, which historians love. Simple answers are rare in ancient history. Egyptians certainly viewed the pharaoh as sacred. He was connected to the gods. He performed religious duties. He represented divine authority on earth. Yet ordinary people did not necessarily spend every moment thinking about the king. Most people were busy surviving. A farmer worried about crops. A fisherman worried about fish. A craftsman worried about work. Life required effort. The pharaoh existed at the top of society, but daily concerns occupied most people's attention. This is another reminder that real life often looks different from official propaganda. Temple walls might portray the king defeating enemies and maintaining cosmic order. Meanwhile, someone in a village is simply hoping the goats stop causing trouble. History contains both stories simultaneously. Life in an Egyptian village. Most Egyptians lived in small communities near the Nile. Their homes were built from mud brick. These houses stayed relatively cool despite the heat. Furniture was often simple. Meals typically included bread, vegetables, fruit, and beer. Yes, beer. Quite a lot of beer. Ancient Egyptian beer was not identical to modern beer, but it played an important role in everyday life. Workers received it as payment. Families consumed it regularly. It was a staple of the diet. History occasionally surprises people with details like this. Thousands of years pass. Empires rise and fall. Yet humans continue finding ways to enjoy beverages. Some traditions are remarkably durable. Did ordinary Egyptians marry their siblings? This is one of the most common misunderstandings. Royal sibling marriage existed primarily within royal and elite circles. Ordinary Egyptians generally did not follow the same custom. Their marriages looked much more familiar. People typically married outside their immediate family. They formed households, raised children, managed farms and businesses. The royal family operated according to unique rules because the royal family claimed a unique status. The king was not simply another citizen, at least according to royal ideology. This distinction mattered enormously. Many practices that appear shocking today were considered acceptable only because they involved individuals viewed as divine. Remove the divine status and the logic quickly falls apart. Building the pyramids. Let's address one of history's most famous myths. For many years people imagined the pyramids being built entirely by slaves. Modern evidence suggests a more complicated picture. The workers who built the Great Pyramids were often organized laborers. Many were skilled craftsmen. Others were seasonal workers supporting massive state projects. Archaeologists have discovered worker villages, tools, food supplies, and evidence of organized labor systems. These discoveries transformed our understanding of ancient construction. The pyramids remain astonishing achievements. Even today, standing beside one is a reminder that human beings have always been capable of extraordinary things. And occasionally extraordinary things that leave future generations wondering how anyone managed it. The fear of the afterlife. Ancient Egyptians spent a remarkable amount of time preparing for death. This might sound depressing. Yet for them it was deeply practical. Death was not viewed as an ending. It was a transition, a journey, a continuation. The afterlife mattered enormously. Tombs were prepared carefully. Objects were buried alongside the deceased. Prayers were performed. Rituals were observed. The famous royal tombs represent the most dramatic examples, but ordinary Egyptians shared many of the same beliefs. Everyone hoped for a successful journey into the next world. The difference was scale. A pharaoh might receive a giant tomb filled with treasures. A farmer had more modest resources. Yet both were preparing for eternity. The best pharaohs and the worst pharaohs. Not every ruler enjoyed the same reputation. Some pharaohs became legendary. Others faded into obscurity. A few became deeply unpopular. Ancient Egyptians appreciated stability. Military success helped. Prosperity helped. Building temples certainly helped. Economic disasters, however, tended to damage a ruler's reputation. As they still do. Some kings left behind monuments that still inspire awe. Others left behind little more than damaged inscriptions and unanswered questions. History can be surprisingly selective. One ruler receives countless documentaries. Another receives a footnote. Neither outcome was necessarily predictable at the time. Why ancient Egypt lasted so long? One of the most remarkable facts about ancient Egypt is its longevity. Civilizations elsewhere rose and collapsed. Empires expanded and vanished. Yet Egypt endured. Century after century. Dynasty after dynasty. Part of this success came from geography. The Nile provided consistency. Natural barriers offered protection. Part came from culture. Egyptians possessed strong traditions, strong institutions, strong religious beliefs. Even when foreign rulers arrived, many Egyptian customs survived. The civilization proved remarkably resilient. Few societies in history have matched its endurance. What the pharaohs wanted future generations to remember. Every monument tells a story. And every story has an author. Pharaohs commissioned temples, statues, and inscriptions because they wanted to shape memory. They wanted future generations to remember victories, achievements, building projects, religious devotion. Very few rulers commissioned giant monuments celebrating mistakes. Curiously enough, the result is that historians must constantly separate image from reality. What rulers claimed, what actually happened, and where the truth lies between those two extremes. Ancient Egypt provides endless examples of this challenge, which is one reason historians never run out of work. The real reason we still care. After thousands of years, why are we still fascinated by ancient Egypt? Partly because the civilization feels timeless. The monuments remain standing. The artwork survives. The mysteries endure. But there's another reason. Ancient Egyptians were dealing with questions that still matter. How should society be organized? Who deserves power? What happens after death? How do families preserve their legacy? How do leaders maintain authority? These questions haven't disappeared. Only the context has changed. That's why Egypt continues to feel relevant. Beneath the pyramids and golden masks are human beings asking very familiar questions. Closing thoughts. Tonight we've stepped away from kings and queens and spent time with the people who actually made Egyptian civilization possible. The farmers, workers, craftsmen, priests, families. The millions of individuals whose names are mostly lost to history, and yet whose labor built one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known. Next time, we'll return to the royal family once more. Because we're finally approaching Cleopatra, the last great ruler of ancient Egypt. Her life would become one of the most famous stories in history. A story filled with politics, ambition, romance, war, and the final collapse of a civilization that had endured for thousands of years. Until then, sleep well. And remember, while pharaohs may have claimed divine status, they still depended on ordinary people to keep the kingdom running. Just like rulers everywhere. Why ancient Egyptian pharaohs married their sisters. Part 6, Cleopatra and the End of Ancient Egypt. Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're arriving at one of the most famous chapters in all of ancient history. A chapter filled with ambition, power, political intrigue, family rivalries, and enough drama to keep historians employed for centuries. We're talking about Cleopatra. Now, if Hollywood has taught people anything about Cleopatra, it's usually that she was a beautiful queen who charmed powerful Roman leaders. That's the simplified version. The real story is much more interesting. Because Cleopatra was not merely a romantic figure. She was one of the most intelligent and politically skilled rulers of the ancient world. And perhaps most importantly for our story, she was the final ruler of a dynasty that had practiced royal sibling marriage for generations. Tonight, we'll discover why. And we'll watch as one of history's greatest civilizations approaches its final chapter. So settle in, relax, and let's return to the banks of the Nile one last time. The dynasty that wasn't originally Egyptian. One of the most surprising facts about Cleopatra is that she wasn't descended from native Egyptian rulers. At least not originally. Her family belonged to the Ptolemaic dynasty. The dynasty began after the death of Alexander the Great. When Alexander conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, he transformed the ancient world. Then, in a move historians often describe as extremely inconvenient, he died unexpectedly at the age of 32. His enormous empire fragmented. His generals divided territories among themselves. One of those generals was Ptolemy. Ptolemy took control of Egypt and established a new ruling dynasty. His descendants would govern for nearly 3 centuries. And unlike many foreign conquerors, they adopted certain Egyptian traditions, including one particularly unusual tradition: royal sibling marriage. The family tree becomes a circle. By the time Cleopatra was born, sibling marriage had become a familiar feature of the Ptolemaic royal family. Brothers married sisters. Sisters married brothers. Sometimes repeatedly across generations. The purpose remained the same. Protect the dynasty. Preserve legitimacy. Prevent outsiders from gaining influence. Keep power concentrated within the ruling family. From a political perspective, the strategy appeared logical. From the perspective of anyone attempting to draw a family tree, it was considerably less helpful. Ancient historians occasionally struggled to keep track of who was related to whom. Modern historians sometimes experience the same problem. The family relationships became extraordinarily complicated. Aunt became stepmother. Brother became husband. Sister became queen. And somewhere a future historian quietly developed a headache. Cleopatra's childhood. Cleopatra entered a world filled with wealth and danger. The royal palace in Alexandria was magnificent. The city itself was among the greatest centers of learning in the ancient world. The famous Library of Alexandria attracted scholars from across the Mediterranean. Trade flourished. Ideas circulated. Knowledge accumulated. It was an extraordinary place to grow up. It was also a dangerous place to grow up. Because Ptolemaic politics were notoriously ruthless. Family members frequently competed for power. Rivals disappeared. Plots emerged. Alliances shifted. Trust was difficult. Survival required intelligence. Fortunately for Cleopatra, intelligence was something she possessed in abundance. She spoke multiple languages. She studied politics. She understood diplomacy. Unlike many earlier rulers in her dynasty, she even learned the Egyptian language itself. A surprisingly rare accomplishment among Ptolemaic monarchs. Cleopatra marries her brother. And now we arrive at the tradition that connects directly to our larger story. When Cleopatra became queen, she was expected to rule alongside her younger brother. According to dynastic custom, she married him. His name was Ptolemy XIII. The arrangement followed long-established Ptolemaic practice. Brother and sister. King and queen. Joint rulers. At least in theory. In reality, the partnership quickly collapsed. Political advisors surrounded the young king. Power struggles intensified. Competing factions emerged. Before long, Cleopatra and her brother found themselves on opposite sides of a political conflict. Which is not exactly what marriage counselors usually recommend. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Civil war followed. And Egypt became increasingly unstable. Enter Julius Caesar. At this point, history introduces one of its most famous characters. Julius Caesar. Caesar arrived in Egypt during a period of political turmoil. Cleopatra immediately recognized an opportunity. She needed support. Caesar possessed power. What followed became one of the most famous political alliances in history. Popular culture often focuses exclusively on romance. But politics remained central. Both leaders benefited. Both pursued strategic goals. Both understood power. Together they altered the course of Mediterranean history. Cleopatra regained control of Egypt. Caesar strengthened his position. For a time, the alliance appeared remarkably successful. History, however, rarely permits stability to last indefinitely. Another brother, another marriage. After the death of Ptolemy XIII, Cleopatra married another brother. Ptolemy XIV. Again, this reflected dynastic custom. Again, the arrangement served political purposes. Again, it demonstrated how deeply sibling marriage remained embedded within the royal tradition. By this point, the practice had existed for generations. Few people inside the dynasty questioned it. It was simply how royal power operated. At least within their worldview. Modern audiences often focus on the unusual nature of the custom. Ancient rulers focused on maintaining authority. Different priorities produce different decisions. The last gamble. After Caesar's assassination, Cleopatra faced a dangerous new reality. Rome entered another period of conflict. Powerful leaders competed for dominance. Among them was Mark Antony. Cleopatra formed an alliance with Antony. The relationship became legendary. Together they challenged their rivals. Together they attempted to preserve their position. Together they confronted the rising power of Augustus, known at the time as Octavian. The struggle would determine the future of Egypt. And perhaps the future of the Mediterranean world. The stakes could hardly have been higher. The end of an era. The decisive moment arrived in 31 BCE. The naval battle of Actium changed everything. Antony and Cleopatra suffered defeat. Their position became increasingly hopeless. 1 year later, Octavian entered Egypt. The Ptolemaic dynasty collapsed. Cleopatra died in 30 BCE. With her death, an extraordinary chapter of history came to an end. For more than 3,000 years, pharaohs had ruled Egypt. Dynasties had risen and fallen. Monuments had been built. Empires had come and gone. Now the age of the pharaohs was over. Egypt became part of the Roman world. The old kingdom disappeared into history. Why the tradition finally ended. The fall of Cleopatra also marked the end of royal sibling marriage as a central feature of Egyptian kingship. Not because people suddenly changed their minds, but because the entire political system changed. The institution that had supported the practice no longer existed. The pharaohs were gone. The dynasties were gone. The religious framework that justified the tradition lost its political foundation. Without those structures, the custom faded away. Which reminds us of an important historical lesson. Practices survive because societies support them. When societies change, traditions often change as well. Even ancient traditions. Looking back across 4,000 years, we've traveled a long way together. From the early dynasties of ancient Egypt to the final days of Cleopatra. Along the way we've explored a custom that continues to fascinate people today. Why did pharaohs marry their sisters? The answer was never simple. Religion played a role. Politics played a role. Dynastic legitimacy played a role. Royal ideology played a role. Together these forces created a system that persisted for centuries. Not because everyone loved it. Not because it was inevitable. But because powerful people believed it served their interests. And throughout history, that has often been enough. Final thoughts. When modern people encounter ancient customs, the first reaction is often surprise. Sometimes shock. Sometimes confusion. Yet history becomes most interesting when we move beyond those initial reactions. When we ask why. Why did people believe these things? Why did these systems develop? Why did they survive? Ancient Egyptian sibling marriage is ultimately a story about power. About rulers trying to preserve authority. About families trying to preserve dynasties. About societies trying to maintain order in a world they understood very differently than we do today. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson of all. The past is not strange because people were foolish. The past is strange because people lived inside different worlds of belief, tradition, and necessity. Understanding those worlds is what makes history so endlessly fascinating. And fortunately for historians, ancient Egypt remains one of the most fascinating worlds ever created. Sleep well. And next time you see a pharaoh in a museum, remember that behind the gold mask was a human being navigating one of the most unusual royal systems in history. Here's the next installment of the script. Why ancient Egyptian pharaohs married their sisters. Part 7, The Pharaohs Behind the Masks. Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're doing something a little different. Over the last several chapters, we've talked about dynasties, politics, religion, and royal marriages. We've followed the rise and fall of kingdoms. We've watched powerful families struggle to hold on to authority. And we've explored one of history's most unusual royal traditions. But tonight, we're going to slow down. Because sometimes history can become so focused on kings and empires that we forget something important. The pharaohs were people. Not statues. Not museum exhibits. Not names carved into stone. People. Very wealthy people. Very powerful people. Occasionally very strange people. But people nonetheless. So tonight, let's look beyond the golden masks and giant monuments. Let's meet the human beings hiding behind them. The problem with being a god. Being worshipped as a living god sounds impressive. And to be fair, it certainly looks good on a resume. But it also came with problems. Imagine growing up knowing that thousands of people expected perfection. Every public appearance mattered. Every ceremony mattered. Every decision mattered. If something went wrong, people looked to the king. Poor harvest? The Pharaoh. Military defeat? The Pharaoh. Economic trouble? Still the Pharaoh. Ancient Egyptians believed the ruler helped maintain cosmic order. That's a tremendous amount of responsibility for one person. Most modern leaders complain about difficult work schedules. Pharaohs were theoretically responsible for the stability of the universe. A slightly demanding job description. Childhood inside the palace. Royal children lived in a carefully controlled environment. From the moment they were born, expectations surrounded them. Princes learned military skills, religious rituals, government administration, diplomacy, court etiquette, and perhaps most importantly, they learned how to behave in public. The palace was always watching. Servants were watching. Officials were watching. Priests were watching. Family members were definitely watching. Because every royal child represented a potential future ruler. Or a potential rival. Sometimes both. Growing up inside a royal family meant growing up inside a political institution. And political institutions rarely provide relaxing childhoods. Brothers, sisters, and rivals. One interesting consequence of royal sibling marriage was that family relationships became even more politically significant. A brother might be a trusted ally, or a dangerous competitor. A sister might be a queen, or a potential threat to succession. The boundaries between family and politics became blurred. In ordinary households, sibling disagreements might involve inheritance disputes or borrowed possessions. In royal households, sibling disagreements occasionally involved control of an entire kingdom. The stakes were somewhat higher. Ancient Egyptian history contains numerous examples of family members competing for influence. Not because they hated one another, although sometimes they did, but because power attracted competition. It always has. The loneliness of the throne. One of the most common themes in royal history is isolation. The higher rulers climbed, the fewer people they could trust. Think about it. If you're the most powerful person in Egypt, how many honest conversations do you actually have? Everyone wants something. Everyone hopes to gain favor. Everyone carefully chooses their words. The result can be surprisingly lonely. Ancient inscriptions often emphasize strength and confidence. They rarely discuss uncertainty, or fear, or self-doubt. Yet historians suspect these emotions existed. Because rulers are human beings. And human beings worry. Even when they're wearing crowns. Especially when they're wearing crowns. Why pharaohs built so many monuments? At first glance, Egyptian rulers seem obsessed with building things. Temples. Statues. Obelisks. Tombs. More statues. Then even more statues. And occasionally a giant statue beside another giant statue. But these monuments served important purposes. They demonstrated power. They honored the gods. They created jobs. They communicated political messages. And perhaps most importantly, they fought against time. Every ruler wanted to be remembered. Some succeeded spectacularly. Others disappeared almost entirely. History can be cruel that way. One king builds a magnificent temple and becomes famous for millennia. Why did people believe these things? Why did these systems develop? Why did they survive? Ancient Egyptian sibling marriage is ultimately a story about power. About rulers trying to preserve authority. About families trying to preserve dynasties. About societies trying to maintain order in a world they understood very differently than we do today. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson of all. The past is not strange because people were foolish. The past is strange because people lived inside different worlds of belief, tradition, and necessity. Understanding those worlds is what makes history so endlessly fascinating. And fortunately for historians, ancient Egypt remains one of the most fascinating worlds ever created. Sleep well. And next time you see a pharaoh in a museum, remember that behind the gold mask was a human being navigating one of the most unusual royal systems in history. Here's the next installment of the script. Why ancient Egyptian pharaohs married their sisters. Part 7, The Pharaohs Behind the Masks. Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're doing something a little different. Over the last several chapters, we've talked about dynasties, politics, religion, and royal marriages. We've followed the rise and fall of kingdoms. We've watched powerful families struggle to hold on to authority. And we've explored one of history's most unusual royal traditions. But tonight, we're going to slow down. Because sometimes history can become so focused on kings and empires that we forget something important. The pharaohs were people. Not statues. Not museum exhibits. Not names carved into stone. People. Very wealthy people. Very powerful people. Occasionally very strange people. But people nonetheless. So tonight, let's look beyond the golden masks and giant monuments. Let's meet the human beings hiding behind them. The problem with being a god. Being worshipped as a living god sounds impressive. And to be fair, it certainly looks good on a resume. But it also came with problems. Imagine growing up knowing that thousands of people expected perfection. Every public appearance mattered. Every ceremony mattered. Every decision mattered. If something went wrong, people looked to the king. Poor harvest? The pharaoh. Military defeat? The pharaoh. Economic trouble? Still the pharaoh. Ancient Egyptians believed the ruler helped maintain cosmic order. That's a tremendous amount of responsibility for one person. Most modern leaders complain about difficult work schedules. Pharaohs were theoretically responsible for the stability of the universe. A slightly demanding job description. Childhood inside the palace. Royal children lived in a carefully controlled environment. From the moment they were born, expectations surrounded them. Princes learned military skills. Religious rituals. Government administration. Diplomacy. Court etiquette. And perhaps most importantly, they learned how to behave in public. The palace was always watching. Servants were watching. Officials were watching. Priests were watching. Family members were definitely watching. because every royal child represented a potential future ruler. Or a potential rival. Sometimes both. Growing up inside a royal family meant growing up inside a political institution. And political institutions rarely provide relaxing childhoods. Brothers, sisters, and rivals. One interesting consequence of royal sibling marriage was that family relationships became even more politically significant. A brother might be a trusted ally, or a dangerous competitor. A sister might be a queen, or a potential threat to succession. The boundaries between family and politics became blurred. In ordinary households, sibling disagreements might involve inheritance disputes or borrowed possessions. In royal households, sibling disagreements occasionally involved control of an entire kingdom. The stakes were somewhat higher. Ancient Egyptian history contains numerous examples of family members competing for influence. Not because they hated one another, although sometimes they did, but because power attracted competition. It always has. The loneliness of the throne. One of the most common themes in royal history is isolation. The higher rulers climbed, the fewer people they could trust. Think about it. If you're the most powerful person in Egypt, how many honest conversations do you actually have? Everyone wants something. Everyone hopes to gain favor. Everyone carefully chooses their words. The result can be surprisingly lonely. Ancient inscriptions often emphasize strength and confidence. They rarely discuss uncertainty, or fear, or self-doubt. Yet historians suspect these emotions existed. Because rulers are human beings. And human beings worry. Even when they're wearing crowns. Especially when they're wearing crowns. Why pharaohs built so many monuments? At first glance, Egyptian rulers seem obsessed with building things. Temples. Statues. Obelisks. Tombs. More statues. Then even more statues. And occasionally a giant statue beside another giant statue. But these monuments served important purposes. They demonstrated power. They honored the gods. They created jobs. They communicated political messages. And perhaps most importantly, they fought against time. Every ruler wanted to be remembered. Some succeeded spectacularly. Others disappeared almost entirely. History can be cruel that way. One king builds a magnificent temple and becomes famous for millennia. Was there really a curse? The short answer is no. At least not according to available evidence. Many individuals involved in the excavation lived long lives. Howard Carter himself survived for years afterward. Several key participants experienced no unusual misfortune. The supposed curse mostly grew through media coverage. Coincidences became headlines. Ordinary deaths became mysterious. Rumors became accepted stories. And before long, the curse achieved a kind of immortality. Ironically, the legend may be more famous than many actual historical facts about Tutankhamun. History occasionally has a sense of Humo, the missing tomb of Nefertiti. Now we arrive at a mystery historians genuinely care about. What happened to Nefertiti? We discussed Nefertiti in the previous chapter. She remains one of ancient Egypt's most famous queens. Yet her final resting place remains uncertain. Some researchers have suggested that her tomb may still be undiscovered. Others believe clues remain hidden within existing royal tombs. Every few years, new theories emerge. New scans are conducted. New debates begin. And historians become cautiously excited. Then cautiously disappointed. Then cautiously excited again. This cycle is repeated for decades. The mystery continues. And until definitive evidence appears, Nefertiti remains one of Egypt's most elusive, the lost library of Alexandria. Strictly speaking, this mystery belongs more to Greek and Roman Egypt than to the pharaohs. But it's impossible to ignore. The Library of Alexandria has become almost legendary. Ancient writers described vast collections of books and scrolls. Scholars traveled from across the Mediterranean to study there. Knowledge accumulated on a remarkable scale. Then, somehow, much of it vanished. Exactly how remains debated. Contrary to popular belief, the library probably wasn't destroyed in a single dramatic event. Instead, it likely suffered multiple setbacks across centuries. Wars, political instability, neglect, changing priorities. The result was the gradual loss of one of the ancient world's greatest centers of learning. Few historical losses inspire more imagination. People cannot help wondering what knowledge disappeared forever. Secret chambers inside the Great Pyramid. The Great Pyramid continues generating theories. Many theories. An almost unlimited supply of theories. Some are reasonable. Some are imaginative. Some belong in science fiction. Modern technology has revealed previously unknown spaces within the pyramid. This is genuinely exciting. The structure continues surprising researchers even today. However, hidden spaces do not automatically mean hidden treasure, or lost civilizations, or secret alien control rooms. History enthusiasts occasionally leap several steps ahead of the evidence. Archaeologists prefer moving a little more carefully, which is admittedly less dramatic, but usually more accurate. Did ancient Egyptians predict the future? Ancient Egyptians certainly practiced forms of divination and prophecy. Like many ancient cultures, they sought guidance from religion. Priests interpreted signs. Dreams carried significance. Oracles offered advice. Yet this differs significantly from modern ideas about predicting the distant future. Many sensational claims attributed to ancient prophecies turn out to be misunderstandings or later inventions. The reality is often less mysterious, but also more interesting, because it reveals how ancient people understood uncertainty. And uncertainty is something every civilization must confront. Why do so many Egyptian treasures survive? This question surprises many people. Why did Egypt preserve so much while other civilizations lost so much? Part of the answer involves climate. Egypt is extraordinarily dry. Dry conditions preserve materials. Tombs remain sealed. Artifacts remain protected. Organic objects survive far longer than they might elsewhere. Part of the answer involves sheer scale. Egypt produced enormous quantities of monuments and inscriptions. When you create enough records, some inevitably survive. Fortunately for historians, and museum curators, and documentary producers, and anyone who enjoys looking at ancient gold. The mystery of forgotten pharaohs. One of the strangest Egyptian mysteries involves rulers we barely know. Some pharaohs dominate history books. Others appear only briefly in surviving records. Entire reigns remain obscure. Names disappear. Monuments vanish. Evidence becomes fragmented. It's entirely possible that significant rulers remain poorly understood simply because surviving records are incomplete. History often feels solid, yet much of it rests on surprisingly fragile foundations. A damaged inscription, a missing document, a lost tomb. Sometimes enormous mysteries emerge from tiny absences. What ancient Egypt still hides? Perhaps the most exciting mystery is the simplest. What haven't we found yet? Archaeologists continue making discoveries every year. New tombs, new artifacts, new inscriptions, new evidence. Ancient Egypt remains one of the most actively studied civilizations on Earth. And despite centuries of research, countless questions remain unanswered. That's remarkable. Imagine a civilization so vast and complex that generations of scholars can spend centuries studying it and still encounter mysteries. Ancient Egypt continues doing exactly that. Returning to our original question, as we approach the end of this journey, worth returning to the question that started everything. Why did pharaohs marry their sisters? Because for the Egyptians, royal marriage was never simply about personal relationships. It was about divine authority, dynastic survival, political legitimacy, religious symbolism, power. The same civilization that built pyramids and inspired legends also created one of history's most unusual royal traditions. Understanding that tradition requires understanding the world that produced it. And that's ultimately what history is about. Not judging the past, understanding it. Closing thoughts. Tonight we've wandered through curses, mysteries, missing tombs, and lost libraries. We've seen how ancient Egypt continues to inspire wonder thousands of years after the last pharaoh ruled. And perhaps that's fitting, because ancient Egypt has always existed somewhere between history and legend. A place where facts and myths often stand side by side. Where every answer creates new questions. And where every discovery reminds us how much remains unknown. In our next chapter, we'll bring everything together and explore the lasting legacy of the pharaohs, the influence they left on the world, the myths they inspired, and why we remain fascinated by them after all these centuries. Until then, sleep well. And remember, somewhere beneath the Egyptian sands, history is probably still hiding a few surprises. Why ancient Egyptian pharaohs married their sisters. Part 9, The Legacy of the Pharaohs and Why We Can't Stop Thinking About Them. Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're reaching the final stage of our long journey through ancient Egypt. We've explored royal marriages. We've followed dynasties across thousands of years. We've met famous rulers, mysterious queens, ambitious priests, and unfortunate heirs. We've walked through tombs, temples, palaces, and villages along the Nile. And through it all, one question has quietly remained in the background. Why are we still so fascinated by ancient Egypt? After all, many ancient civilizations existed. Many built monuments. Many produced powerful rulers. Yet ancient Egypt occupies a unique place in the modern imagination. Mention Rome and people think about emperors. Mention Greece and people think about philosophers. Mention Egypt and people immediately picture pyramids, mummies, golden masks, and pharaohs. Something about Egypt refuses to fade away. Tonight, we're going to explore why. So get comfortable, settle in, and let's take one final walk along the Nile. The civilization that refused to disappear. Most ancient civilizations eventually vanished. Their cities collapsed. Their languages disappeared. Their traditions faded. Egypt was different. Even after foreign conquests. Even after dynasties ended. Even after the last pharaoh ruled. Egypt itself continued. People remained. Communities survived. The Nile continued flowing exactly as it always had. This continuity gave Egypt an unusual place in history. Unlike many ancient cultures, it never completely disappeared from memory. Travelers continued visiting. Writers continued describing it. Legends continued growing. The story never truly ended. It simply changed chapters. The power of giant monuments. Let's be honest. The pyramids help. A lot. History contains many impressive achievements. But few are as visually overwhelming as the Great Pyramids. Even today they appear almost impossible. Visitors arrive expecting large structures. Then they stand beside them and discover that large is a spectacular understatement. The pyramids dominate the landscape. They dominate photographs. And they dominate the imagination. For thousands of years people have looked at them and asked the same question. How did they build these? It's one of the oldest mysteries in the world. And one of the most effective advertisements any civilization has ever created. The discovery that changed everything. For centuries, much of ancient Egypt remained mysterious. Then, in the 19th century, archaeological discoveries accelerated dramatically. Ancient inscriptions were deciphered. Temples were excavated. Tombs were uncovered. Lost histories emerged. One breakthrough proved especially important. The decipherment of hieroglyphs. For generations, Egyptian writing had remained silent. The symbols survived. The meaning did not. Then scholars finally unlocked the code. Suddenly ancient voices could speak again. Kings described victories. Officials recorded achievements. Priests explained rituals. The past became far more detailed. History transformed from speculation into conversation. Why mummies capture the world's imagination? Of all Egyptian traditions, mummification may be the most famous. And perhaps the most misunderstood. Popular culture often treats mummies as monsters. Ancient Egyptians viewed them very differently. Mummification represented respect, preparation, preservation, a way of ensuring survival beyond death. The process reflected deep religious beliefs. The body mattered. Memory mattered. Identity mattered. To Egyptians, preserving the dead was an act of care, not horror. Of course, centuries later, novelists and filmmakers discovered that mummy curses sold tickets. History occasionally loses control of its own image. The pharaohs become legends. Something unusual happens to famous historical figures. Over time they become larger than life. Facts blend with stories. Stories blend with myths. Eventually the real person becomes difficult to separate from the legend. Ancient Egyptian rulers experienced this transformation on a massive scale. Tutankhamun became the Golden King. Cleopatra became the legendary queen. Ramses became the mighty conqueror. Their historical realities remain fascinating. But their legends became even bigger. And once legends take hold, they are remarkably difficult to remove. What the pharaohs would think of us. This is one of those impossible questions historians secretly enjoy. What would ancient pharaohs think if they could see the modern world? First, they would probably be astonished by technology. Airplanes, computers, electric lights, the internet, modern medicine. The list goes on. But they might also recognize familiar patterns. Governments still seek legitimacy. Leaders still build monuments. Families still worry about inheritance. People still debate religion. Power still attracts ambition. Human nature remains surprisingly consistent. The details change. The basic challenges often do not. The strange success of royal propaganda. One of the most impressive achievements of Egyptian rulers is something they never could have anticipated. Their propaganda worked. Thousands of years later. Think about it. Pharaohs commissioned giant statues because they wanted to appear powerful. Today, tourists see those statues and conclude that the pharaohs were powerful. Mission accomplished. Ancient rulers wanted to be remembered. They wanted future generations to admire them. And here we are. Still discussing them. Still visiting their monuments. Still studying their lives. It may be the most successful public relations campaign in human history. The real lesson behind royal sibling marriage. At the beginning of this series, our question seemed simple. Why did pharaohs marry their sisters? By now, the answer looks much larger. Because the custom was never just about marriage. It was about identity, authority, religion, power. The royal family believed it occupied a sacred position in society. Sibling marriage reinforced that belief. It distinguished rulers from ordinary people. It preserved dynastic claims. It imitated divine models found in mythology. The practice emerged from a specific worldview. Without understanding that worldview, the custom appears bizarre. With understanding, it becomes historically meaningful. Still unusual, but meaningful. History's greatest time capsule. Ancient Egypt functions as one of history's greatest time capsules. The dry climate preserved artifacts. The monuments survived. The inscriptions endured. The tombs protected objects for millennia. As a result, we can reconstruct ancient lives with extraordinary detail. We know what people ate, what they wore, what they believed, what they feared, what they hoped for. Few civilizations leave behind such a rich record. And every new discovery adds another piece to the puzzle. The last pharaoh leaves the stage. When Cleopatra died in 30 BCE, the age of the pharaohs ended. But their story did not. The monuments remained. The myths survived. The questions continued. Generation after generation returned to Egypt searching for answers. Some found treasures. Some found mysteries. Some found entirely new questions. The conversation never stopped. And perhaps it never will. Final reflections. Over the course of this journey, we've explored one of the most unusual traditions in royal history. We've discovered that sibling marriage among pharaohs emerged from a unique combination of religion, politics, mythology, and dynastic ambition. We've met kings who believed themselves connected to the gods, queens who shaped history, families who treated power as something sacred, and ordinary people whose labor sustained an entire civilization. Most importantly, we've learned that understanding history requires more than reacting to what seems strange. It requires understanding why people made the choices they did. The ancient Egyptians lived in a world very different from our own. Yet beneath the gold masks and temple walls, they were still human beings. They worried about family, legacy, power, death, the future. The same concerns that continue shaping human lives today. And perhaps that's why ancient Egypt remains so captivating. Because beneath all the mystery, we recognize ourselves. Just a little. Though hopefully with slightly less complicated family trees. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the world of the Pharaohs. Sleep well. And may your dreams involve fewer succession crises than those of ancient Egypt. End of series.